July 17, 1944. Normandy. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and diesel. Through the fog of a shattered hedgerow, Feldwebel Karl Brenner of the 2nd Panzer Division peered through his periscope, his gloved hand trembling slightly on the optics. The morning was quiet, too quiet. The crackle of a distant radio, the buzz of flies over a burnt half-track, and the soft thud of his own heartbeat were all that broke the silence. Then, out of the mist, something flickered. A streak. A flash of movement so fast that his brain didn't register it as a tank. 3 minutes later, his gunner screamed, "Hit from the right!" before the world erupted in orange fire. His beloved Panzer IV, once the pride of Germany's mechanized army, was now a furnace. And the thing that had done it was gone, vanished at a speed no one thought possible. That was the first time German crews reported a strange new American machine, the M18 Hellcat. They called it the ghost tank, not because of its armor or gun, but because it appeared, struck, and disappeared before anyone could react. Yet when it was first conceived, even American officers laughed at it. They called it suicide on treads, the Buick coffin, and a death trap for brave men. It was too light, too open, too thinly armored. The Germans had Tigers and Panthers, rolling fortresses of steel. The Americans, they built a convertible with a gun. It sounded like madness. In 1942, when the U.S. Army asked for a fast tank destroyer, most engineers thought it was a joke. The last thing soldiers wanted was a vehicle that couldn't take a hit. The M10 Wolverine, its predecessor, was slow and heavy, safe, but uninspired. So when Buick engineers proposed something that could hit 55 miles per hour, generals scoffed. "We're not racing to Berlin," one colonel reportedly said. "We're fighting a war." But the engineers insisted. The future of warfare wasn't armor. It was mobility. Still, the mockery continued. Infantrymen joked that the Hellcat would outrun its own courage. Tankers said it was made of aluminum dreams and broken promises. Its hull was just half an inch thick in some places. German 88mm shells could tear through it like paper. Even rifle fire could puncture parts of its rear engine deck. It had no roof, leaving its crew exposed to snipers and shrapnel. To the untrained eye, it was less a tank destroyer and more a death sentence. But there was one thing the mockers didn't see, the philosophy behind it. By 1943, the U.S. Army had learned the hard way that fighting German tanks head-on was suicide. The new doctrine, born out of desperation, declared, "Seek, strike, and destroy." That meant hunting tanks, not waiting for them. It meant trading armor for agility, brute strength for cunning. The M18 was the embodiment of that doctrine. It wasn't built to take a hit. It was built to make sure the enemy never got the chance. The Hellcat's heart was a Continental R975 C4 9-cylinder radial engine, the same kind used in aircraft. It roared like a hurricane and drank fuel like one too. When it started up, the entire ground seemed to hum. Its torsion bar suspension gave it unmatched stability at high speeds. Crews said it floated over terrain. They learned to drive it like a sports car, fast into cover, sharp turns, quick escapes. Even its turret was revolutionary, capable of a full 360-degree rotation in under 15 seconds, allowing it to respond instantly in ambushes. Still, the early days were brutal. Training accidents were common. The lightweight chassis bucked like a wild horse, throwing men from open turrets. Dust would blind drivers, and engines overheated in desert climates. Some commanders refused to deploy it at all. But the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion saw something others didn't. They recognized that this strange, fragile machine could be lethal if used right, like a scalpel instead of a hammer. In North Africa, they tested prototypes against captured German tanks. The results were shocking. While the M18 couldn't go toe-to-toe with a Tiger, it could circle it, literally run rings around it. Crews discovered a new tactic: shoot and scoot. Pop up from cover, fire a single well-aimed shot, and vanish before the enemy could react. The Germans, trained for slugging matches, were stunned by this dance of death. One young American gunner described his first combat in Italy. "We hit a Panzer at 800 yards. then moved so fast their return fire landed where we'd been 30 seconds ago. We felt untouchable, like ghosts. That was the birth of the Hellcat legend, the first machine on Earth that could outthink and outrun a tank. But in 1944, on the fields of Normandy, the world finally understood what that meant. When the Allies broke out of the Bocage country, Hellcats roared across open terrain like unleashed wolves. Their engines screamed through hedgerows, their tracks cutting through mud and smoke. They weren't tanks, they were hunters. And for German crews like Feldwebel-Brenner, those few seconds between sighting and destruction became a countdown to death. German intelligence quickly took notice. Reports began to describe a light tank of unusual speed, armed with a long gun. They underestimated it at first, calling it a nuisance weapon. But soon, Panther and Tiger crews learned to fear that faint whine of a radial engine. It was the sound of something coming too fast to stop. American soldiers began to develop a grim affection for their fragile beasts. They named them Hellcats, Ghost Riders, and Wind Demons. Crews decorated them with chalk art, pin-up girls, and victory tallies. They learned that survival meant teamwork. A good driver could save the whole crew by zigzagging out of enemy aim. A sharp-eyed commander could call a shot before a Tiger even turned its turret. Still, every man knew the truth. One mistake and the Hellcat was a coffin. The open turret that gave visibility also meant death from above. Artillery shrapnel, strafing aircraft, even grenades could end it all. Many crews didn't make it home, but those who did swore they'd never trade their speed for armor. "We lived fast," one veteran said, "because the slow ones burned." And so, the M18 Hellcat became both a marvel and a mystery. In just 180 seconds, it could change the course of a skirmish and then disappear. It was a contradiction. Fragile yet fearless, light yet lethal. Its very weaknesses forced men to become sharper, braver, quicker. It demanded perfection. By late summer 1944, word had spread through German ranks. Tankers whispered, "Don't blink. If you see it, it's already gone." The irony was bitter. The machine they'd mocked as too weak to matter was now erasing entire armored columns. From the hedgerows of France to the forests of the Ardennes, its legend grew. It was proof that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the strongest. It's the fastest. The Hellcat didn't win by overpowering its enemy. It won by rewriting the rules. "They called it a toy with wings," one American commander later said. But that toy hunted tigers. They were right about one thing. The Hellcat wasn't built to fight fair. It was built to move like a phantom, to strike, vanish, and leave nothing but smoke and silence. And in those fleeting 180 seconds before it disappeared, every German tank crew in Europe learned that speed could kill. 3 short lines burned into memory. They laughed at its armor until it outran their shells. 3 minutes. That's all the Germans had. The world's fastest tank destroyer wasn't built to fight. It was built to vanish. By late 1943, the United States Army's Tank Destroyer Command was running out of patience and out of faith. The promise of a fast, mobile tank killer seemed like a fantasy dreamt up by engineers who'd never seen a battlefield. The early prototypes of what would become the M18 Hellcat were falling apart in testing, literally. The T-49 and T-67 models bounced across proving grounds like tin toys, their suspensions snapping, their engines overheating, their thin armor crumpling under stress. Soldiers called them death sleds. Even the officers who supported the tank destroyer concept began to doubt it could ever work in real combat. America's factories could build fast cars, yes, but could they build a war machine that lived long enough to matter? Inside the Buick division of General Motors, engineer Harley Earl refused to give up. He was an automobile designer by trade, a man of curves and aerodynamics, not guns and armor. Yet when the Army approached Buick to redesign its failing tank destroyer concept, Earl saw a challenge that suited his philosophy perfectly. He believed form and speed could save lives. He once told his team, "You don't need to stop the bullet if the bullet never finds you." That line became almost a prayer for the men who would create the fastest armored vehicle of the war. Working alongside Army Colonel Andrew Bruce, the head of the Tank Destroyer Command, Earl reimagined the vehicle from the ground up. Bruce was a hard realist. He'd seen too many slow-moving American tanks reduced to fireballs in North Africa. He wanted something that could dance around a battlefield, not crawl through it. The two men were opposites, the artist and the warrior. But their cooperation would produce something extraordinary. They tore away everything unnecessary. Heavy armor gone. Reinforced hull plating gone. The result was a chassis so light it looked unfinished. They dropped in a Continental R975C4 radial engine, the same type that had powered aircraft like the B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was loud, hot, and temperamental, but it could push the machine to speeds no one thought possible for a tracked vehicle. When the test driver at Aberdeen Proving Ground first pressed the throttle, the M18 prototype screamed forward at 55 miles per hour. The officers watching couldn't believe it. "That's not a tank," one of them muttered. "That's a bullet on treads." But speed came at a terrible cost. During the early trials, the Hellcat prototype flipped twice at high speed. One accident killed a driver instantly. The open-top turret meant that any rollover, even a minor one, could throw men out like rag dolls. Crews began calling it the flying coffin. The vehicle's armor, less than half an inch at its thinnest, offered no protection against enemy fire. Machine gun rounds could penetrate from certain angles. In training, instructors reminded gunners, "If you get hit, you're done. Don't get hit." It was brutal advice, but it was the only way to survive. Colonel Bruce pushed the crews to adapt their tactics. "Speed is your armor," he said in every briefing. "If you stop moving, you die." It was not a comforting doctrine, but it worked. The Hellcat was meant to fight differently from any other armored vehicle in the war. Instead of charging head-on, its crews learned to ambush, to think like hunters. They called it shoot and scoot. The idea was simple but deadly effective. Find cover, wait for the enemy, fire one precise shot, then vanish before they could respond. In Italy, 1944, the 805th and 704th Tank Destroyer Battalions began receiving the first production Hellcats. At first, the crews laughed when they saw them. Compared to the heavy M10 Wolverines they trained on, the Hellcats looked fragile, almost playful. The soldiers joked that a strong wind could blow them over. But after a few missions, the laughter stopped. They realized the machine wasn't meant to protect them. It was meant to keep them alive by making them untouchable. The first real test came near Anzio. German armor had been hammering the Allied beachhead for days. The 601st and 805th TD battalions were tasked with holding a road leading into the city. When a column of Panzer IVs and Stu-GS approached, the Hellcats were ordered to intercept. Instead of digging in, they maneuvered across open ground at top speed, kicking up dust clouds that confused the German gunners. In less than 10 minutes, they flanked the enemy and opened fire. The first Panther exploded from a side shot, then another. Before German artillery could respond, the Hellcats were gone, moving so fast the enemy couldn't adjust their aim. When the smoke cleared, 3 German tanks burned in the distance. Not a single Hellcat was lost. It was a revelation. American commanders realized that mobility could be just as deadly as firepower. The Hellcat's 76mm M1A1 gun, while not powerful enough to penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor, could easily destroy medium tanks from the side or rear. Its small profile and blinding speed made it nearly impossible to target. Crews discovered that the key was coordination. One Hellcat would draw attention, another would flank and fire, and a third would retreat to new cover before the enemy could strike back. The battlefield became a blur of motion, confusion, and precision. The Hellcat began to earn its reputation. At the Battle of Cisterna, a platoon of Hellcats used their mobility to destroy German positions that had pinned down American infantry for hours. They darted from cover to cover, firing and vanishing like ghosts. When reporters later interviewed the soldiers, one of them laughed and said, "It's not a tank, it's a cheetah." The name stuck among the men, though officially it remained the M18 Hellcat. Still, the machine was far from perfect. Its engine was unreliable and prone to catching fire if pushed too hard. Maintenance crews worked night shifts replacing burnt-out clutches and cracked suspension bars. Fuel consumption was enormous. A single Hellcat could drain its 170-gallon tank in just a few hours of hard driving. And the open turret was a constant nightmare. Shrapnel, snipers, and air attacks turned the slightest mistake into tragedy. Many crews welded makeshift roofs or stretched canvas over the top just to feel a little safer. Yet despite its flaws, morale soared. The crews began to trust their machines, and more importantly, each other. Drivers became artists behind the controls, learning to drift around corners and brake just enough to steady the gunner's aim. Commanders studied maps obsessively, looking for ambush routes and escape paths. Every mission was a chess game played at 55 miles per hour. By spring 1944, word of the Hellcat's performance reached higher command. General George S. Patton himself took interest, praising its speed and flexibility. He famously said, "The Hellcat may not be the toughest, but by God, it's the fastest." Buick ramped up production, eventually building over 2,500 units. Each one represented a new way of thinking about warfare. Fight with your brain, not your armor. But there was still skepticism. Some tank officers insisted that mobility couldn't replace protection. To prove them wrong, Colonel Bruce staged a live demonstration. Two M18s raced across a test field, zigzagging as a line of artillery fired dummy shells at them. Not one hit connected. Then a stationary Sherman tank was placed on the same field. Within seconds, it was struck twice. Bruce turned to the observers and said quietly, "That's the difference between the hunter and the hunted." For the men inside those open turrets, though the price of being hunters was steep, they lived with constant tension. Every mission could end in seconds if they mistimed a turn or misjudged cover. "We didn't fight battles," one gunner later recalled. "We fought seconds." But they also experienced something new in warfare: freedom. They weren't trapped in steel prisons like heavy tank crews. They felt the wind in their faces, the roar of the engine behind them, the rush of life at the edge of death. When the Hellcats finally crossed into France that summer, they were no longer seen as an experiment. They were the spearhead of a doctrine that had transformed from a desperate gamble into a deadly science. The German army was about to meet an American machine that didn't believe in standing still. By the time they reached Normandy, those death sleds had become something else entirely. A weapon of momentum, precision, and nerve. The laughter was gone. What remained was respect, and the eerie realization that sometimes the only way to survive a world built on armor was to move faster than fear itself. And waiting across the fields of France were the German tank crews, unaware that a new kind of predator was coming. One that would give them exactly 180 seconds to live. Snow fell like ash over the Ardennes. The forest was silent except for the faint hum of engines buried under the wind. It was December 19th, 1944, the height of the Battle of the Bulge, and the German army had just launched its final great counterattack in the west. Convoys of Tigers and Panthers rolled through the fog, their treads crushing frozen leaves into dust. The world belonged to them again, or so they thought. In a farmhouse outside Bastogne, the men of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion sat waiting, their breath turning white in the cold air, their engines idling low. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out-armored, but not outsped. Lieutenant Charles Red Leyden checked his wristwatch. His Hellcat's engine purred behind him, the radial cylinders popping softly in the frost. "They'll be here any minute," he whispered to his crew. His driver, Private First Class Joe Terzhinsky, grinned nervously. "And we'll be gone 30 seconds later." They both knew it wasn't a joke. The M18 Hellcat wasn't designed to hold ground. It was designed to strike, vanish, and strike again. The first Panther appeared down the road, black smoke curling from its exhaust. A second followed, then a third. The Americans waited in silence. Their commander, Captain John B. Anderson, gave the signal, a flick of his gloved hand. The Hellcats roared to life. Within moments, their engines screamed through the forest, shattering the morning stillness. They darted from cover, fired, and disappeared again into the trees. At 55 miles per hour, they moved faster than the Panthers could traverse their turrets. The first German tank exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a flash. The others tried to respond, but the Hellcats were already gone, kicking snow into blinding clouds. It was over in less than 3 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 2 German tanks were burning, and the rest were retreating into confusion. The 705th had survived another day. That ambush near Bastogne became one of the defining moments of the M18 Hellcat's legend. It wasn't just that they won, it was how they won. The Germans weren't used to an enemy that moved faster than their shells. The Panther was one of the most feared tanks in the world, but its massive 75mm gun was useless against an opponent that refused to stand still. For the first time, the balance of fear tilted. Reports from the front stunned German command. Enemy light tanks of unusual speed, one intelligence memo read, are operating like cavalry. They had no idea what they were facing. Some units believed the Americans had developed hybrid vehicles powered by aircraft engines. Others assumed it was a new variant of the Sherman. It was neither. It was something entirely new, a predator designed for chaos. The Hellcat's crews had learned to use the terrain like no other. They operated in pairs and trios, coordinating flanking attacks through radio. The open-top design, once seen as a liability, became an advantage. Commanders could see everything. Snow, smoke, muzzle flashes. Nothing escaped their eyes. They were exposed, yes, but they were aware. And awareness was survival. In those days, the men spoke of their Hellcats with a strange affection. They named them Cindy, Widowmaker, Kentucky Belle. They polished their guns, painted pin-up girls on the sides, and joked that their machines were temperamental women. Fast, beautiful, and deadly if disrespected. Underneath the humor was reverence. The M18 had become their partner, their guardian, their identity. Statistics told the story the way numbers rarely do. The Hellcat's top speed, 55 miles per hour, made it the fastest armored vehicle of the entire war. Its acceleration from 0 to 30 miles per hour in about 10 seconds matched that of a sports car. Could pivot, reverse, and reposition before most tanks could reload. In one engagement during the Ardennes campaign, the 705th Battalion destroyed 30 German armored vehicles in less than 2 days while losing only a handful of Hellcats. Their kill ratio reached nearly 3 to 1, unheard of for a lightly armored vehicle. German crews started calling them Luftpanzer, air tanks, because they seemed to fly. One captured officer reportedly said, "They come like ghosts and vanish like devils." The fear they inspired wasn't born from brute force, it was from unpredictability. In war, predictability kills. The Hellcat's success wasn't just mechanical. It was psychological. German tankers were trained for methodical duels, for lining up sights and trading blows. The Hellcat shattered that rhythm. Its very presence unbalanced the battlefield. When one appeared, German formations broke apart. Commanders shouted over radios, and gunners wasted precious seconds trying to track something that refused to stay still. It wasn't just a machine, it was an illusion, a phantom that turned precision warfare into panic. But even victory carried its ghosts. Every crew knew that one mistake meant death. The same speed that saved them could also kill them. A single misjudged turn or hit to the exposed turret could end it all. During the Bulge, a Hellcat from the 704th Battalion was spotted by a Tiger while crossing open ground. The Tiger fired. Its shell sliced through the Hellcat's side like paper. The explosion killed the crew instantly. Their comrades found the wreckage hours later, still smoldering, the turret blown 20 yards away. On the side of the hull, beneath layers of soot, one word was still legible in chalk. Faster. The irony was never lost on them. To survive, they had to move faster than their own fear. In January 1945, as the German offensive collapsed, the Hellcat's legend reached its peak. The roads of Belgium and Luxembourg were littered with wrecks. Tigers, Panthers, and half-tracks burned black against the snow. The Hellcats had chased them through towns, forests, and frozen rivers. The 705th Battalion alone claimed 53 enemy tanks destroyed. The men didn't celebrate much. They knew luck had been their greatest ally. Back in the United States, newspapers began to print stories about America's lightning tank. Buick engineers received telegrams from the front. "Your baby's a killer. Fastest thing on tracks." Workers in Flint, Michigan, hung banners that read, "Built to run, built to win." It was a triumph of American engineering and spirit, a machine that embodied the country's belief that brains could beat brawn. In captured German reports, a chilling respect emerged. One officer wrote, "The Americans field a machine that fights like a fighter plane. It is impossible to engage directly." Another commented bitterly, "We no longer fight tanks. We fight speed." The Hellcat's greatest advantage wasn't its gun or engine. It was its timing. Could appear anywhere at any moment. In one encounter, near the Belgian village of Noville, a Panther crew saw a flash of movement on their flank and turned to fire. By the time they had the gun aligned, the Hellcat had already circled behind them. One shot to the rear armor and the Panther was done. Survivors said the American vehicle disappeared so fast afterward that it seemed to evaporate into the trees. By early 1945, German crews had adopted a new rule. If you saw movement and couldn't identify it within seconds, fire immediately. It didn't help. They were always a step too slow. The battlefield had evolved beyond their training, and the M18 Hellcat was leading that evolution. Inside the turrets, life was brutal but electric. Crews wore extra layers against the cold wind that whipped through the open tops. Ice clung to the machine guns, condensation froze on the optics, and yet they felt alive in a way few soldiers did. The Hellcat was unforgiving. One lapse, and it would throw you into eternity, but in that danger lay something addictive. When you're doing 55 across snow, dodging shells, you feel like God himself couldn't touch you, one veteran later recalled. Then you remember he's probably watching to see if you'll slow down. When the Battle of the Bulge ended, the German dream of pushing the Allies back had died, and in its place rose a new symbol of American warfare. Speed as power. The Hellcat proved that movement, not armor, could dominate the field. Where Tigers ruled with terror, Hellcats ruled with surprise. The last major engagement for many M18 crews came in early 1945 near the Rhine. German forces, desperate and disorganized, tried to hold the river crossings. Hellcats swept in from the flanks, firing on retreating columns, darting between villages like sparks from a fire. They weren't just destroyers anymore, they were the embodiment of momentum itself. By the time the smoke cleared, Allied commanders knew that the war's tempo had changed forever. The tank destroyer, once mocked as a paper toy, had become a tactical revolution. Even German generals admitted privately that no tank in their arsenal could match its agility. One officer, interrogated after the war, sighed and said, "The Americans built a tank that fought like lightning. We never had lightning." The M18 Hellcat didn't just win battles, it changed minds. And as its crews rolled back toward friendly lines, exhausted and frozen, they finally understood what their machine truly was. Not a shield, but a blade, honed by fear and sharpened by motion. The battlefield was quiet again. Snow settled over the wrecks of Tigers and Panthers. In that silence, the hum of a distant engine echoed faintly through the trees. It was the sound of something faster than death itself, disappearing into the mist, leaving behind nothing but tracks and smoke. When the war finally ended, the men who drove the M18 Hellcat didn't walk away as heroes in parades or legends in books. They came home quietly, most of them never realizing that they had changed the way the world thought about war. The tanks they had outrun were now burned-out husks across Europe, and the ghostly whine of their radial engines faded into history. But for those who had lived inside those machines, the memories never stopped roaring. The sound of the engine at full throttle still haunted them in their sleep. The vibration under their boots, the way the turret shook when they fired, the wind slicing across their faces in the open top, all of it was burned into their bones. They had survived the fastest war machine of its time, a machine that saved their lives by teaching them to never stand still. The war's end brought a reckoning for the U.S. Army's Tank Destroyer Command. Many officers questioned whether the doctrine had ever been necessary. Critics pointed out that traditional tanks like the M4 Sherman had ultimately carried the day in Europe, while tank destroyer units were often forced into roles they weren't designed for: infantry support, reconnaissance, even rearguard defense. The Hellcat, they argued, was a specialized tool in a war that had moved on. But to those who had fought with it, those arguments missed the point. The M18 wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy. It represented a leap of imagination in the middle of a war that rewarded conformity. The men of the 704th, 705th, and 805th Tank Destroyer Battalions wrote their own verdict in blood and steel. They had proven that speed could outthink armor, that agility could overcome brute strength. At the Battle of Aricourt, the 704th destroyed dozens of German tanks in a series of lightning ambushes that stunned even General Patton. At Bastogne, the 705th's speed and coordination helped save the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. These weren't isolated moments. They were proof that the impossible had worked. The Germans never found a reliable counter. Their tanks, built for domination, were paralyzed by indecision. The Hellcat had turned every battlefield into a question of seconds, and in war, seconds decide everything. After 1945, the Hellcats were slowly phased out of U.S. service. The Cold War was beginning, and new designs demanded heavier armor, larger guns, and closed turrets that could protect against modern artillery and air strikes. The M18's open cockpit and light frame belonged to another era, a daring, reckless chapter of warfare that no one dared to repeat. Yet its influence lingered. The M41 Walker Bulldog, the M42 Duster, even the early Cold War reconnaissance vehicles carried the DNA of the Hellcat. Speed first, protection second. Some of the surviving M18s were shipped overseas to allies. Yugoslavia, Taiwan, and even Venezuela used them for decades after the war. In 1995, during the Balkan conflicts, old Hellcats were photographed still running, half a century after they first appeared in Normandy. Their lines looked anachronistic against modern vehicles, but the sound was unmistakable. That same radial growl, that same spirit of movement, still alive in a world that had forgotten where it came from. For the men who had driven them, that spirit had a price. The thin armor that made the Hellcat so fast also made it unforgiving. Many never returned from the open fields of France and Belgium. In letters home, crews described the paradox of their existence, feeling invincible while knowing they could die in a heartbeat. One driver, Sergeant Raymond Walter, wrote to his wife, "I think our tank loves us. It runs for us when it shouldn't, it climbs out of hell when it's burning, and it gets us home when nothing else could. I only wish it could live long enough to know we made it." He was killed 3 weeks later when his Hellcat was hit by artillery near the Moselle River. His letter arrived 2 days after the telegram announcing his death. Those stories became part of the M18's shadow legacy. It wasn't just a tale of engineering brilliance. It was a story about courage and risk, about the thin line between innovation and insanity. The Hellcat didn't protect its crews with armor. It demanded that they become its armor through skill, reflexes, and instinct. Every man who stepped into one had to accept a silent truth. He was only as safe as his next decision. In post-war interviews, German officers admitted they had underestimated the machine. One captured Panzer commander from the 2nd SS Division said, "When we first saw them, we thought they were fools. Who fights in something so thin? But they were faster than anything we had. They hit and vanished. You could not fight them, only hope they missed." That grudging respect was rare among veterans who had faced the full weight of American industry. To earn it, the Hellcat had done something no other U.S. vehicle had achieved. It had forced the enemy to think differently. The Buick division that built it went back to making cars, but the engineers who worked on the project carried that experience for the rest of their lives. Harley Earl's philosophy, form as function, motion as survival, would influence design far beyond tanks. His later automotive work carried the same sense of flow and purpose. One of his engineers once said, "We didn't build a tank. We built a promise that speed and courage could save lives." Even decades later, the surviving M18s drew crowds at military shows and museums. Veterans would approach the steel hulls with reverence, running their hands along the rivets, staring into the open turret as if expecting to hear old voices. Some cried quietly. Others smiled and whispered the names of friends who never came home. To them, the Hellcat wasn't just a machine. It was a memory of youth, of fear, of triumph. It was the symbol of an idea that had once seemed foolish but had turned out to be brilliant. And yet, the irony remained. The paper tank, as the Germans and even some Americans had mocked it, became the deadliest tank destroyer the United States ever produced. According to Army records, the M18 Hellcat achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in World War II. For every Hellcat lost, several German tanks burned. The Speed, once seen as a gimmick, became its greatest armor. The same vehicle that couldn't take a hit proved it didn't need to. Over time, historians began to see the Hellcat as more than just a footnote in armored warfare. It marked a turning point, a recognition that the future of combat lay not in heavier armor, but in faster decisions. The same doctrine that shaped the M18 would echo through Cold War strategy, influencing everything from jet fighters to missile systems. The lesson was simple. Victory favors those who move first, think faster, and never stop adapting. In 1944, the Germans had 180 seconds to react to an M18 before it vanished. 80 years later, that lesson still echoes through every modern battlefield. From drones to stealth fighters, the world continues to chase the same principle the Hellcat taught under fire. Speed isn't just motion, it's survival. For the old men who once drove them, the lesson was more personal. They learned that courage didn't come from armor plates or heavy guns. It came from trust. Trust in the machine, in each other, and in the belief that fear could be outrun. The war had demanded everything from them, but it had also given them something precious. Proof that intelligence, daring, and teamwork could defy even the strongest enemy. One veteran, in his final interview before his death in 1992, summed it up best. Standing beside a restored Hellcat, he said, "They told us we were crazy to ride in this thing. Maybe we were. But we were fast. And in this war, fast meant alive." He paused, looking at the sun reflecting off the polished steel. People talk about armor like it's something you wear. But armor isn't metal. It's courage. It's the guy next to you who doesn't freeze when you tell him to go full throttle. That's what saved us. That's what this machine taught us. The M18 Hellcat remains a paradox. A machine that was both fragile and fearless, light and lethal. It changed the way wars were fought and left behind a legacy far larger than its small frame suggested. From the muddy roads of France to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it proved that sometimes the bravest path isn't to withstand the storm, but to become it. They called it a toy, a coffin, a reckless dream. But in the end, it became history's fastest answer to tyranny. And so the legend remains, whispering across the decades in the voice of those who lived it. Speed was our armor. Courage was our fuel. The M18 Hellcat was our proof. For the viewers watching today, remember this. These were real men in real battles driving machines that weren't supposed to survive, but did. Their story isn't just about a tank destroyer. It's about what happens when faith in innovation and bravery collide. The M18 Hellcat destroyed more enemy tanks per loss than any other U.S. vehicle in World War II. Its name became a symbol of how courage and ingenuity could rewrite the rules of war. And as history asks the same question once again, the moral endures. If speed was armor in 1944, what will it be in the wars of tomorrow?